Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon. This conversation is with Joe Seltzer. Joe's a teacher's teacher. He's capped off a 40-plus year career all at LaSalle University. He's still very active in our different societies, about which you'll hear in this conversation. And then there's kind of a bonus piece to this. After we've talked about teaching with Joe, we're going to hear about his practice as a wood artist, which in many ways ties into his teaching. It's a little longer than some of the other sessions, but I think the bonus round, hearing Joe talk about how he became a practicing wood artist, which is something he'll continue to do probably for the rest of his time, is well worth the extra few minutes. So here is Joe Seltzer. Well, this is another one of those moments that Peter Vail was really looking forward to in his last weeks, as we were about to resume the podcasting series after he fought still another bout with a flu, a bout that he didn't win this time. And Joe and I feel very sad about that, and I'm sure that it'll be addressed in our conversation today. But one reason that Joe said he would like to join us anyway is that he wanted to honor Peter. So that's definitely one of the many reasons why Joe Seltzer, who's retired from LaSalle University as a management educator, will be a very interesting person to talk to today. 2 points that I think of immediately about Joe, and then we'll get started. One is a word, lasting. My main accent, lasting. And it describes all the years that Joe has been part of the Organizational Behavior Teaching Society, the way he developed his and published his teaching exercises, and particularly, since I'm looking at one right now, he makes these beautiful little wooden turnings, that almost all bowls or dishes, out of exotic woods. And these will outlast me. When they come in here hopefully 20 years from now and clean out my office, they'll be looking at these and saying, oh, now hopefully there are other things about you and me, Joe, that'll last, but certainly your bowls will last. And you've given them out as gifts every time we've met at the Eastern Academy or the Art Behavior Teaching Society. So
you probably have a fairly good collection at this point.
I have a wonderful collection, and it symbolizes a lot of good memories. What do you think about that, Joe? I mean, are you favored by the notion of being a lasting presence in our lives?
I guess I have always thought of myself as, people talk about earth, water, fire.
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought of myself as earth, kind of solid, stable ground. And kind of as such, I guess that's going to be lasting. Certainly water and fire aren't very lasting. But earth is kind of there, and it's the foundation on which other things get built. And I've always thought of myself that way. And I certainly, with the two organizations that you mentioned, and I'll mention a third one, have this sense of building some kind of an hopefully enduring legacy.
Mm-hmm.
I went to my first Eastern Academy, I think in 1974, as a doctoral student with a bunch of other doctoral students in an old station wagon that I owned. It was at Penn State, and one of the other people's brother went to Penn State and had a house, which they weren't using because it was summertime. And so there were like 6 of us that stayed in the house, and we went to the conference. It was my first academic conference. It was interesting, a little more confrontational than I had expected. This was the Eastern Academy.
Oh,
at a
yeah, that was back
particular
in the
time.
day. You had discussants who would
Yeah.
tear your paper apart and all of that.
And I have gone to every Eastern Academy since then. So this year, when the Eastern happens, although it's going to happen a little differently this year, but when it happens, I think it'll be my 46th or 47th one in a row.
Wow.
That's pretty stable.
And
it seems to capture me.
It's durable, that's for sure. And let's just pick on that one for a moment, because you met people at the Eastern, and still to this day, who are not always the same people in the other two societies that you're about to mention. But when you were a doctoral student, it was the same time I was a doctoral student, 73, 74 or so. You remember some of the folks that you met who you went, wow, what an interesting person, or, oh, I read his book, or I read his article, and some of what we used to call the founding fathers of the Eastern, and mothers?
Well, let's see. The one thing that stands out to me, and I think it was at the Eastern, was that one of my friends that I had met elsewhere was Gary Powell.
Yep.
And Gary Powell knew Max Wortman.
Yep.
I think he'd had him as a teacher. And as we're walking from wherever we were staying to the conference one morning, we ran into Max Wortman, who I did not know, but I knew his name because he was president of the Academy of Management at the time. Right. And Gary knew him because he had been one of his students. And Max said, I'll take you to breakfast, which I always thought was kind of a very impressive idea. I'm going to breakfast with the president of the Academy of Management.
Yeah.
We went to a McDonald's, but it was a special event, and one of my lasting memories from that time. I think that may have been my second Eastern. It couldn't have been very many more than that. I think I was still a doctoral student at the time, or a very new faculty. And I've had a couple of other occasions over the years where I've had a meal with one of the big names in our field, and those have always been pretty memorable. In part because they were big names in the field. If I'm telling stories, let me tell another quick one, which is
telling stories. That's what we want.
I was doing some research on burnout and leadership. And for leadership, I decided I would try a new theory, a new at the time theory, which Bernie Bass had put out, called transformational leadership.
Yeah.
And I wrote to Bernie, who I had never met, but I wrote to him and said, I'd really like to use your questionnaire in this study and describe what I wanted to do. And he was very generous and said, sure, I'd be happy to share this with you. I would like to have the data after you're done. And I said, that would be fine. So I worked on this with a woman named Rita Numeroff, who was actually mostly a consultant, and had developed a burnout scale that she was using in her consulting. And so I was putting together leadership and burnout. And I worked on this, collected data from mostly MBA students, convenient sample of people I was teaching, but a fairly large sample, and did some analysis. And eventually I wrote to Bernie Bass and said, I've got some interesting results. I'd like to share them with you. Can I take you to breakfast at the Academy of Management meeting? And so he agreed, and we went. I don't think it was a McDonald's. I don't remember where we went to breakfast, but we went to some breakfast. And partway through the breakfast, he began complaining that he had had a paper that he sent in to the Journal of Management that had gotten rejected when the reviewer had said, this really isn't anything new. This is just like initiating structure and consideration. I had also collected data on initiating structure and consideration. So I said to Bernie, Well, I can look at that because I've got that data already. And I did. And I could show statistically that you could add a statistically significant, not very big, but statistically significant amount to the variance you could explain if you added transformational leadership. So the first step, put in initiating structure and consideration. The second step, put in transformational leadership dimensions, and I could add to the variance you could explain of whatever my independent variable was. I think it might have been burnout, but it might have been something else too. Mm-hmm. So I have a paper with Bernie Bass in the Journal of Management.
Yeah.
And another paper in another journal that he just got kind of, we talked about something else, and so that got added in as well. And so I have two publications with the person that was arguably the biggest name in leadership, mostly as a result of taking him to breakfast and his saying, I just got this paper rejected, and me being able to say, I've got data on this. Let me go back and run the analysis and see if I can add to the variance. And I could, and we got that paper published.
Oh, that's
and so that's always been another of my highlight things.
But it also gives folks who don't know much about this aspect of our academic life how, in the best circumstances, it works. And secondly, why it's so important to have these professional societies like the Academy of Management, Eastern, and so forth. The first part is it works to the extent that people who, like Bernd Bass, who were well advanced in our mind in the field back then, is willing to attend. And that was important. But even moreover, he was vulnerable. He said to this, green doctoral candidate, Joe
I think I was
Seltzer,
actually a young faculty member at the
time. But
still, it was like he didn't know me very well.
He didn't have to buy you breakfast or even listen to you.
No, I bought him breakfast, but
or even let him know you were rejected.
Yeah.
I mean, he was rejected because there's a bit of a lot of rejections of that nature happen before or you resubmit, but it's part of the process. But that's a wonderful coincidence. And the last point is that back to lasting. When you do have your name now next to Bernie, next to Bass, in those two articles, they're never going to go away. They're always going to be there.
And that one still gets cited.
I'm not surprised, because if anything, we're a lot more interested in transformational leadership and burnout these days than we were before, 45 years ago, with themes I think were fairly normal back then. Well, maybe not. We had an energy crisis going on, a bunch of other stuff, but nothing like we're going through now.
Well, in any case, I had one more quick story that kind of falls in the same thing. Dorothy Marsick, who had been a friend from when we were both doctoral students together, had written a book of exercises.
Yeah.
And it had gone through, I think, 4 editions. And it never sold that many copies because it was basically easy to photocopy and use a few exercises out of, but it sold a few thousand. Usually first time through, so that the person could also get the instructor's manual, and then felt comfortable enough with the book and the instructor's manual that they tended to keep using whatever they liked out of it. But anyways, it was a nice book of exercises. And she asked me, she was kind of tired of doing a lot of the work to get it to the next, edition. And she asked me if I would collaborate with her on the 5th edition of the book. And I happily said yes, and I worked on that for months, and the 5th edition came out. And then a couple years later, the publisher wanted to do a 6th edition, and Dorothy said to me, I think I really want to ask Peter Vail to do this. And so she did. I agreed, and she did, and we worked with Peter. And so I have published a book with Peter Vail.
Yeah.
It's the 6th edition, and I think it was published in 91. I'd have to look at it, which I can do
I'll make sure it's cited on our webpage.
Yeah,
but there you go.
Anyways,
that's how you come back around to.
And what Peter contributed was mostly a series of about 10 exercises that we put into different places, and a few of which I had to do a little rewriting on, and a few of which I just did a little bit of how to structure it into the format that Dorothy had developed years before.
Mm-hmm.
But I ended up spending a fair amount of time talking to Peter at that point. Peter was somebody that I knew from the Organization Behavior Teaching Society, now called the Management and Organization Behavior Teaching Society. And I had known, and I went to that conference. I think I went 46 times to the Eastern. I went 45 times to the OBTC. I started when I was a doctor. I was still a doctoral student, but near the end of my doctoral program. I think it was a year later. My friend Don Bowen said, "You really ought to go to this conference." And the first day I went, it was at Harvard that year. And the first day that I went, I go to a cocktail party kind of reception thing. And I immediately am introduced to Chris Argyris, who was one of Don's mentors. And so it was like I went with Don, and so I got introduced to Chris Argyris, and I met Peter Vale. I'm not sure exactly when, but fairly shortly thereafter. And so it's somebody I had known for many years, and I hung out with him a little bit, but I really got to know him much better when we worked on this book. And I was considerably saddened when I got your message that he had died. I was looking forward to this day where I would see him again. Though the only time I've seen him in the last large number of years was when he did something at the MOBTS Fellows thing a year ago, and we had him
on
Zoom, and there were other fellows in the room. There were
including Dorothy Marsick,
including Dorothy and several other people I'm sure we'll mention today. But there were like a dozen of us in the room, and Peter was there on screen, and that was a kind of a highlight of that whole conference for me. It was just seeing him again.
When he was paralyzed, it was 2001, and so it was nearly 20 years. And a couple of times in those org behavior teaching conferences, I would bring Peter in virtually before it was easy. One time in Milwaukee, he literally, Emily, his daughter, helped him fly from Minneapolis to Milwaukee. Went through a tremendous amount of challenge with his wheelchair and everything. Got him set up in a motel, and he was going to come over and have because he was so eager to see people and to have people respond to his thoughts, which meant a lot to him. And then he had an accident trying to get out of his wheelchair to the bathroom, something like that, and they had to put him in a hospital.
And I remember he ended up in a hospital. I don't remember who it was that was the...
Yeah, Emily took care of him.
Who was the chair of the conference at the time, but they were I remember them being real disappointed that it was like he was here, but then...
Here, but not here. So what did we do? So this is what sort of leads to Peter and me doing podcasts when he could no longer sit at his laptop and comfortably revise and write. We figured out how to patch him in through a conference phone back then. This is a few years back.
Yeah.
And turn the volume way up, and the room was full, and have, people speak into this conference phone, the kind we see on our conference tables. And at least, there was an interaction, because interaction was so important to Peter. I think it is to all of us as teachers, but that was quite a moment. And he reflected on that not that long ago, and I believe in one of our podcasts, that he missed that. And another time, the Legacy project that was run by the society, they captured him in his home office in his wheelchair, and he talked about things that were still on his mind and things that he still was going to work on, and he did, and that's where we got to the point of looking at practice. But let's go back to lasting. For one thing, you were with both of those societies a long while, and through our ups and downs and twists and turns. Could you put your thumb on why it's important that both societies are still viable? Because that was an open question. There were nonprofits. There were no big bucks involved. It was basically volunteerism. And why are they important, and how do we keep them that way?
I think that one of the things that professional organizations do is provide a home base for faculty. Mm-hmm. That it gives you a place to go and to share with other people similar to yourself, especially for people that work at schools where they're relatively isolated in their own department and may have only one or two people that have similar interests to what they have. Professional organizations provide a really nice way to connect to people. A second really important feature, at least to me, is that I realized over time that almost all of my friends were professional. I do have some people that I know in this area, but almost all of the people that I knew were through the profession, and many of whom I only saw once or twice a year at conferences. And yet I had these really strong relationships with people because they had lasted for quite a long time.
Get reinforced.
And they get reinforced every year. And we always had a starting topic of the conversation, which is what's happened this last year, and what are you working on now, or what are your interests, or what are the struggles that you're having right now. But it was always an easy connection to people. I particularly remember the Organization Behavior Teaching Conference, where there were several people who annually I went on a long walk with, like for an hour or 2 hours even. And we just talked, and we would walk, occasionally sit someplace, but mostly we'd just walk around the campus that we were on that year. And those were very important conversations for me, just to kind of catch up with people and to kind of reflect on what's happened for me this last year and to listen to what happened to them for the past year. The one that stands out most directly is Susan Herman, who actually I only talked to a little bit other than the times that we went for long walks. It was like I'd run into her at the conference and would say hi, but it was like, when are we going for a walk? And we would then have this wonderful conversation for an hour. And then I wouldn't see her again for another year, basically.
But we'd pull her back into board meetings. I was on the board with her at that time. We kept her very busy. But in an hour with Susan Herman, and I'm looking over here at my Susan Herman Service Award for the society, which I'm very proud of. And I could picture her instantly. She not only was teaching in Alaska, but she had a second home in Jackson, Wyoming, where my daughter happens to be right now. And when Susan and I would catch up, it would be, how are you doing professionally? And then we'd want to talk about Jackson, Wyoming. She loved it out there, and fabulous and beautiful spot, as you can imagine, among the Grand Tetons. But I would characterize her as similarly to one of those eagles that I would see on the Snake River when we take the raft trips. They'd be up, and they were wonderful nest builders, but the nests were huge. And when they came off that nest and started to hit those updrafts, it was breathtaking. And her personality to me, her spirit to me, was like that, wasn't it, Joe? It was like,
yeah.
wonderful
Spirit, yeah.
Wonderful spirit. And similarly to Peter, when she was going through the real tough part of her illness that took her away, she's right up to the last minute. That spirit was just soaring. And so we have no doubt that it's gone on. And maybe the two of them have met because they did know each other at one point. Yeah, I think for any kind of practice where people have no intention to ever not do it, to keep doing it indefinitely, part of it, of course, is the results you can achieve, in your case, within the classroom, on the page. Those are all very nice and have something to do with building a legacy. But I think the aspect that I'm hearing here with your walks and with your looking forward to these renewals is that you, like all of us, I think, who are very serious and have indefinite ends to our means, we just want to keep going, need that kind of collaborative energy, that kind of give and take. And frankly, actually, we need appreciation.
Yeah. And honestly, this has been a very tough year so far, knowing that those things won't happen in at least the same way. I'm certainly not going for a walk with anybody.
No.
I am having some phone conversations. We did the MOBTC, which is the third conference that I've been part of.
Yep.
One of the nicest things has been that it's Mid-Atlantic Organization Behavior Teaching Conference, but it draws people who are both Eastern Academy and MOBTS folks. So it's got kind of, between the three conferences, I see a fair number of people twice a year now. I see a few people like you 3 times a year, which is even better.
Yeah.
And doing that virtually, it was really nice to see images on the screen like I'm seeing right now of a friend. It's not quite the same as just being there with a friend.
No.
And so I'm feeling some sadness this year about the fact that I won't be seeing the friends that I would otherwise see at those conferences. And I have this really wide circle of friends that have been built up over many years and considerably all over the country, some of whom I'm no longer in touch with, some of whom I'm somewhat greater contact with. But there were all these people that have been important at one point or another in my life, and where I've spent a fair amount of time and hopefully have been important in their lives as well. So,
well, I have, and believe me, Joe, I go on for a couple hours on how important all your contributions have been to those 3 organizations from a managerial standpoint, certainly in helping us build what I hope will become lasting when we're no longer directly involved. But the other thing is that in those 3 instances, they were all about us as educators, particularly as teachers. How did you, over that accumulation of the relationships, both for scholarship as well as for teaching, how did it bring you into the classroom in a different way after each conference, for example, when you had to go back in the fall?
That's a tougher question because it wasn't, at least 2 of those conferences are summer conferences. And so it was months before I went back to teaching often. But it gets to another piece that I was actually going to talk about. So let me just kind of back off for a second and start there and come back to your question.
You got it.
In a bit. Which is that when I think about practice for myself, I think about teaching. I spent 40 years at LaSalle as a faculty member in organizational behavior. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Definitely.
When I first started teaching at LaSalle, it was because there was a person who happened to be the dean. His name was Bruce McLeod, who was an OB person. And I wanted to go to a place that had at least one other OB person because I wanted a colleague. And the fact that he was the dean was it's still a colleague. And we did stuff together for some years. But one of the things he said is, I have a course in interpersonal communications, which right now is being taught by a guy in the psych department, but you can have the course. So I taught that course for, I don't know, somewhere between 10 and 20 years, every semester, and sometimes a couple of sections a semester. I taught an introductory organizational behavior and management class, more organizational behavior than straight management. And it was a required sophomore year course. And I taught that one for maybe 10 years. And I'll get to where that kind of went. We had an MBA program. I was hired the year they started the MBA program. And they hired 3 faculty to be part of the MBA program. Another fellow named Les and I taught there. Les is he's semi-retired now. We taught there for 40 plus years, so they did pretty well hiring that year. Yeah. And I taught an introductory organizational behavior class every semester for the whole time I was there. At some point, I'm not sure when, it was somewhere between 10 and 20 years in, that class was changed largely at my suggestion because my interest had also moved to a more practice-oriented focus, which was, I would call, developing management skills.
Yeah.
There was a book by Wortman and Cameron that came out with that title. Wortman and Cameron came annually to the OBTC.
Yes,
and formed a small group of people who taught managerial skills classes. And I joined that group kind of as an interest group. And so at some point I said, I really want to change our course from kind of a straight OB to developing management skills. I was already using the Wortman and Cameron book from the very first edition, and wanted to be able to focus the course more on developing skills. At the time, I was teaching an undergraduate course in OB. I was teaching an undergraduate course in interpersonal communications, which is clearly managerial skill. I was teaching a graduate course in what started as OB and transformed into managerial skills. I'll tell you the title in a second. And I was teaching a graduate course in managerial skills lab, which was an intensive 2-weekend long course. So that's where my teaching was for pretty much all of the first. I would have to go and look at records to tell you exactly. Somewhere between 10 and 20 years of my career became what I was teaching. The title of the MBA class was a self-assessment for leadership. It had a very strong self-assessment component. We did a 1-day self-assessment workshop as part of the course where they participated in several different things with several different faculty. And it was a required MBA course. So over the years, several thousand people went through that class over the years that I
Talk
taught.
about building a foundation.
Yeah. So to me, in my whole career, I taught either the OB class or the one that followed it, the self-assessment for leadership, every semester. At some point, the interpersonal communications, I don't recall exactly how I lost that course, whether we just didn't have enough students some point or I transferred into doing other things. We developed a full-time MBA, this may be why, and we got accredited, and the accreditation reduced the number of sections that I taught in a year. So I taught the full-time MBA, I taught the part-time MBA, I taught the full-time MBA, which was mostly managerial skills, but with a little bit more theory background in it because those people didn't have a lot of work experience, where the part-time MBA, they all had work experience and could take whatever I talked about on a Monday night and presumably do it in the office on Tuesday.
There you go.
And I taught organization design at one point, maybe for 10 years. But by the end of my career, I was teaching a graduate full-time MBA course each semester, a graduate part-time MBA course each semester. One semester I taught an undergraduate teams class, again, managerial skills, and the other semester I taught a graduate teams class. And so at least the last 10 years of my career, that was my teaching each year. So although I hadn't really thought about it, that had the same level of stability that I started talking about a long time ago, which is I figured out how to do things. I continued to do them. I was the stable part of the system. And I did them for many years pretty happily. I mean, these were things I really enjoyed teaching.
Well, I can't imagine, given your seniority, that you would have done that much that you weren't going to enjoy. You had every right to do that. But I hear in that, though, Joe, there's that lovely notion that things have to change in order to stay the same. You know, that syllogism. But there's probably as you were moving through those, there were, and I know because we had conversations about it, or you would go to someone's workshop and come out of a session and say, hey, I might like to try that. So you were more than tweaking, you were kind of building it, growing it, so that each semester it was in many ways the same, but in a lot of ways different. And I'm going to use that I didn't interrupt your thought there, but I want to segue that in a moment.
Okay. I have one more thing to add, which is
that point.
You started by asking the question, what did I do with what I got from the conferences?
Yes.
And what I got from the conferences were lots of new teaching ideas. Oh, yeah. I primarily went to the pedagogical sessions, the exercise sessions, to see what I could find that seemed fun and useful. Those were my two criteria. It had to be something I wanted to do and I thought would be useful to the students in the class, or to make a point that I wanted to make about some theory, but mostly it would be useful to the students.
Yeah.
So that idea of what did I get from conferences was exactly what I was just talking about, which is I taught a pretty stable set of courses over the years, and I was able each year to modify pieces of the course because of the conferences I went to.
There's also the shifting more toward the skill. Not that you were taking theory out of the picture at all, but you were drawn by the folks like Kim Cameron to practice, to say useful practice. I want to see the students grow in their skill. What Peter and I would say, if Peter were on here right now, he would say, well, skill is as in a constant state of improvement as well, if it's connected to the belief that one can continually learn and refine that skill. To teach the how-to, and then it drops off because it was done in a classroom, but they can't see the transference, is not all that useful. But what Peter would say is, I think every one of us should have the goal to create a better, if not superior, learner by the time they're through our experience. So he put a tremendous emphasis on the connection between the doing and the skill building within the theoretical realm, but also wanted to cultivate that confident learner, the competent learner who could take those skills into a practice domain, like we have.
And the focus of the courses that I taught, the title, Self-Assessment for Leadership, was very much consistent with what you just said,
Yep.
which is I'm going to try to teach some skill stuff. in this course. It's a baseline. It's the how-to part.
Mm-hmm.
You have to kind of assess yourself. What do you do well? What could you improve on?
Mm-hmm.
What can you use from this? And then work to do those things and try to.
Yeah.
And the papers that I assigned over the years were always talk about skill improvement, and talk about how you had been able to make personal something that we had talked about. I used what I call personal application papers always for two reasons. One is, honestly, as opposed to case studies where you read 30 of the same case, and by the 24th you begin to get more than a little bored with the case. The skills papers, because they were always personal, were always more interesting because they were always about the person.
There you go.
They never really overlapped with each other. There was always a degree of, I'm working on this skill and someone else is working on the same skill, but the papers were always personal about me and my situation, the student and his situation. And that made it much, much more interesting. But it was also the same thing that you said about Peter's perspective, which was, I want you to take this and apply it to your work experience or to your life experience.
Yeah, and I think that was a very strong thread through all the old behavior and Eastern kinds of sessions that weren't strictly about paper. Research papers, Experiential Learning Association, which you certainly helped out on over the years. We really we honored theory, but we knew that the theory would be accessible ongoing. We showed them where it is, who wrote it and why, and how to judge whether it would be of a merit for use. But what we also said is, you're out there in a very changing environment. Now it's an extraordinarily changing environment, and you really have to be self-led for starters. And then after that, don't try to go completely without theory. Come on back, come on home, reach out, and you'll have the best of both things. As we're moving into the last few minutes, I've got to capitalize on something that also goes along with my notion of lasting and leaving legacies. I have in my hand one of those nice little cup you gave me. So tell me about how wood turning has similar dimensions to it in the Joe Seltzer.
So when you first introduced this to me, doing a podcast, you said, I want to talk about your practice of doing wood turning. And it's like,
and here I'm giving you 3 minutes to do it.
Yeah, well,
we got time.
So what I did in 1985 is to go and see an exhibit of wood turning. I had bought a book at a museum store of wood art, and it was an exhibit that was in Arizona and then traveled to the Renwick. And so Margie and I went down to DC, basically, which we did relatively often at the time. We went down to DC to see what the exhibit was at the Renwick, and I was just blown away. And I just thought the stuff was beautiful. And I said, I've seen stuff like this at local craft shows. And so I started going to local craft shows and buying wood art. I did that for a long time, in part because I know one of the steps in doing wood art is you have to sand the wood, and that never appealed very much. But at some point I joined our local club, Woodturning Club. And I did that in part because it gave me a place to go and see people that were doing wood turnings. And every month people would bring in what they had done in the last month and would show it. And I took pictures of that and occasionally bought pieces from the people. It really wasn't so much a sales opportunity as it was I was willing to buy it and they were willing to sell it. I don't think very many other people bought anything, but I did relatively often. I also saw some of these same people at various local craft shows, which I went to fairly frequently. And so I became a collector of wood art. At some point, I met a person who was quite serious about wood art. His name was Albert Leacoff, and he actually started a museum of wood art, which still exists in the city, although he's retired from being the director. But it's called the Center for Art in Wood. I visited Albert and talked to Albert, and I met a number of really well-known artists through Albert. And eventually, one of the collectors said, I think we ought to have an organization. And so there was a meeting held in Little Rock, Arkansas, because that was where this collector lived, and invited people to come to a conference. And a number of people came, and there was an exhibit that she had organized at the Arkansas Art Museum, where she was an important patron. It was an exhibit of wood art, and we also visited her house where she had a pretty extensive collection. They invited not only collectors, but also artists, so a bunch of artists came, and I bought a bunch of pieces from the artists. It was a wonderful experience.
Must have been.
And we had one meeting where we decided, we were talking about creating an organization. I'm sitting in this meeting, and there are all these wonderful ideas. And I looked around and realized that people are talking about these neat ideas, and nobody is writing them down.
There goes the management professor.
And so I took out some paper and I took notes, which ended up me becoming the secretary of the organization, which is not exactly the ideal job for me because I'm not that good a note taker. But since nobody else was doing it, it was better than nothing.
Yeah.
And we created an organization called the Collectors of Wood Art, which still exists, although it's in the process of transforming itself somewhat right now.
Wonderful.
And I served on the board for a dozen years of the Collectors of Wood Art, and was including a term as president of the Collectors of Wood Art. And we ran some exhibitions and some conferences. And it was just another group of people that I enjoyed being with.
Yeah.
So I had these two connections to wood turning. One was the Collectors of Wood Art, and the second was my local Woodturning Club. And one of the things I went to was the national organization called the American Association of Woodturners. And I went to their conference every year, as well as anything else I could find on either of those two topics. So in 1998, the club had a little loaner lathe that they would loan out to people for a period of, it was about 2 feet wide, a very small lathe and they would loan it out to someone. And so I said, I'll borrow it. And I said, I'm going to be smart about it, though. We didn't have meetings in the summertime. We did 10 months of the year, not in the summer. And so I said, I'm going to borrow it right at the beginning of the summer, and then I can have it the whole summer. But I don't really know how to turn. So I made an arrangement with a very well-known wood turner named Palmer Sharpless. He was the one that had the lathe at his house. He was storing it for the club. So I went to his house, and I said to Palmer, I would like some lessons in how to turn, and I will pay you for the lessons, and then I will take the lathe after a few lessons and take it home and practice. And so I did. And because my collection is mostly smaller objects, up to about 7 inches in diameter is almost my whole collection. Many are an inch or 2 in diameter. And because I liked small objects, and because this was a pretty small lathe, I started turning small objects. I initially just got pieces of wood. You can buy exotic woods from various sources, and sometimes people would give me pieces of wood. If they were doing something large, there would be some cutoffs, and I'd get some cutoffs. So initially I was just turning pieces of wood, and I started just accumulating these pieces of wood. And most of them were similar in size. They were 1.5 to 2 inches, 2.5 inches occasionally. But that was the size I was comfortable turning. And I was comfortable turning it, I decided, as I thought about it, for several reasons. One is I'm a bit impatient. To turn a piece that big takes me somewhere between about 25 and 45 minutes total time, from starting with just a block of wood, or even starting with a big block of wood and having to cut the wood into smaller pieces, to the finished final piece that I finish pretty much in the same way all the time, which I'll get to in a minute. But it's about that long, which meant that on a normal day I could go down to the basement for an hour or two and turn 2 or 3 pieces, 4 pieces of wood, and it was fun. And I often had a flow experience. There's a literature in a field called flow, which is where people get so kind of engaged in the process of doing something that they lose track of time, as one of the characteristics of flow. And I found that often happened for me. I would start on something, and sometime later I'd realize I'd been down in the basement for an hour or 2 hours, and at some point, not too, and I enjoyed this a lot. At some point, not too many years later, maybe a year or two later, one of my friends from the club, who had a number of lathes, had an opportunity to buy a new lathe that was similar in size, but a little bit bigger than the one that he had in his basement. He had ones that were bigger than that too, but he had this small, relatively small, but very good lathe. He was actually a machinist by trade and was helping out the company making these lathes called Oneway by doing some beta testing on their new lathes. And so he had one of their smallest lathes, which is about 3 feet wide. You can do a piece about 12 inches high, and about, if you were doing like something that was long, you could do something maybe 2 feet long on this lathe, which is pretty big compared to the little teeny lathe I was using, where you could do something about 6 inches and about a foot long. So this was like a step up from what I was doing. And so I bought his used Oneway lathe, which is the last lathe that I'll ever need to own, because it does everything I want to do. It's very powerful compared
There's
to
a
the
lesson about tools.
little one. And he beta tested a larger version of the same lathe for the company, so he ended up with a bigger one that was basically similar. And so I've had that lathe, I would guess, since 2002, 2003, something like that. And so I continued turning, and I accumulated all of these things that were handmade. And so I decided that they would be nice things to give to my friends. And since I saw my friends infrequently but consistently, I began taking them with me and giving them to people. There's one more piece to this story that I think is an interesting practice piece, and I'm not
okay.
And that is that initially I used whatever wood I had, whatever size pieces I had, and I turned a variety of different woods. But I noticed if I took a box, and I typically liked being able to do small pieces, in part because I could put a box of them in my pocket or in my briefcase and pull out the box and show it to Dave and say, Dave, pick a piece of wood. But if I had a box and it had 9 things in it, and they were 9 different woods, old Dave would be sitting there and looking at each one really carefully and trying to decide.
It's a huge decision.
So what I realized was it would be faster if I made all 9 pieces from the same wood.
Yep.
And then people would look at the wood and see the pretty grain in the wood. And I could never make 9 that looked exactly the same.
No.
And they were always individual.
Each, and they were bowls for the listener.
And they were almost all bowls. And I changed designs several times, and I did other things a few times. But
the wood has always had a story behind it too. Can you tell us a bit about the wood?
And some of the stories were really extensive stories.
Oh yeah.
You have a piece, I'm pretty sure, of bristlecone pine. The bristlecone pine is one of the oldest living things on Earth.
Is this it?
It could very well be. It would say on the no. That looks like a maple burl.
Okay.
But in any case, the bristlecone pine is looks kind of like pine. It's got like lines through it. And it would say on the bottom, bristlecone pine. You don't need to find it, Dave. I'm pretty sure you have one.
Well, I have my curator. I'll call him to find my bristlecone.
The bristlecone pine is one of the oldest living trees on Earth. And it mostly grows on the top of the Rocky Mountains. And you're not allowed to cut it. However, there is a farm up there. Someone owns a piece of a mountaintop and can document that this particular bristlecone pine forest burned 110 years ago. And the wood is still there.
Mm-hmm.
There was a fire, the trees died, but the wood is still there.
Mm-hmm.
And they go up and they harvest that wood and they sell the wood. And I turned bristlecone pine one time. And
wow, you're touching 1,000 years of
this wood
nature.
is like 1,000 years old.
Well, now I got to figure out how to sell it and get myself some real money here.
Yeah, well, it's real easy to turn, and it's not hard to find. If you look on eBay, you can buy bristlecone pine right now. But it all comes from dead trees because you're not allowed to turn.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to cut down a tree to do it.
No.
There are a few other woods that have similar stories of the wood can't be cut unless it's dead. That I've turned. You probably have a piece of pink ivory wood. That one would look pinkish. And pink ivory wood comes from Africa, and it was a royal wood. It was only tribal chiefs were allowed to have it. It also was you can't cut a live tree. You can only cut a tree that's died. And it has a fairly bright pink color. No, it's pink. You would notice.
I'm going to find it. Otherwise, I might have missed that year when you and I, that was the one conference I missed. I know, I'm glad we had this as our final segment because there's so many cross hatches between where we started and where we are now. The fact that I can look over to my shelves next to me here and see not only what you've made and gifted, very generously, but on the bottom, you sign it, and you in which year? 2006.
I date
them. So there is a lasting quality to these. There's a theory first and then practice part of your story, Joe, because first you were an appreciator. You acquired other people's the products of their practices out of appreciation, and because you wanted to add to their value, you helped create an organization around that. But then you somewhat gingerly moved into having your own lathe, but you took the leap of having someone who's highly expert teach you. So, I mean, that's like I felt when I was trying to get piano lessons when I was little. I was lousy at piano, but I went.
Yeah.
In your case, you went and you got good. So your story comes out better than my piano story.
Well, your piano story seems like my clarinet and saxophone story, actually.
I think we could really do a whole book around how many times we failed at our lessons when we were kids. But you didn't. You didn't fail, and you combined the fact that you could lose track of time. You're in flow. That you have learned a great deal about wood by making these bowls and other small gift objects. You brought them back and you reinforced friendships. You signal new friendships by placing a bowl in the hands of someone you just met. I'm sure someone who's in their 30s or even late 20s has come into one of our organizations feeling green, feeling overwhelmed by us old timers who seem to be able to hug and know each other. By having a Joe Seltzer moment and have that bowl in their hand is, I'm sure, was transformational, to go back to Mr. Bass.
Yes.
So a lot goes on in the Joe Seltzer life. In your last minute or two here, Joe, final thoughts. Certainly you've given us tremendous insights into you, into teaching as a practice, and how you're turning yourself forward into something that you can now do as long as you wish for the rest of your life, I hope, which is wood art. How would you like to have this?
What I realized as I've been reflecting on the wood art is I know that I did this in part because it was a way of connecting with the friends that I had.
Mm-hmm.
And it was something that came from me. It was handmade by me.
Mm-hmm.
And a good wood artist can actually make 9 of the same things. Think
Mm-hmm.
about the spindles in a in a stairwell.
Yeah.
They all look the same. Those are mostly, in especially old staircases, turned.
Mm-hmm.
And a skill is being able to make 9 or 15, however many you need, that look exactly the same.
Yep.
In my case, I don't have a need to try to make them look the same. I want them to look similar to make them easier to pick.
Mm-hmm.
But they turn out the way they turn out.
Yeah.
And I found that the sanding, which is done with power tools mostly, and using the lathe as a power tool to sand, is relatively simple. And I don't do stuff that needs a lot of hand sanding. So that was the part I was least happy with. I finish it with a shellac finish,
Mm-hmm.
and then I use what's called Renaissance wax, which is a museum quality wax that doesn't pick up fingerprints.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a satiny wax. It's not a high shine. It's a satin finish. And all the pieces you have are done the same way. I try to sign the bottom of every piece, at least if it's got a really small bottom. Sometimes it's just my initials. Most of the time, it's my name and the name of the wood and the year that I made it, at least the last 2 digits of the year that I made it. And although I'm not going to show them because it doesn't make any sense, I have a tray here of 20 pieces of maple burl that I just turned, thinking that they would be really nice show and tell for this session, but which makes no sense if it's just an audio recording.
Well, you might kick me into video podcasting at some point, just so I can have that opportunity. But I can tell folks as we're closing here that there's connections upon connections upon connections in what Joe has shared with us today. I think of the thousands of students, Joe, who pass through your special way of teaching as handmade. No one of them exactly like the rest, but all having been held with care during a period of time when you were teaching them, and they're out in the world now. They're polished. I can torture this analogy a little further. They're solid, and you've helped them become integrated and high-performing people. That's a damn good piece of work there, Joe. So
thank you.
Between your bowls and your students.
That's a really nice. It's a really nice thing to say.
Handmade by Joe Seltzer.
And they're probably. I have a number of friends. You being one of them that has a pretty extensive collection, because I see you 3 times a year generally,
mm-hmm.
and have given you a bowl for many years. I have made well more than 1,000 bowls. I have no exact count, but it's well more than 1,000, and they're all out with my friends.
Out with your friends.
And that feels good to me as well. So.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Joe. And
hey, this has been really fun.
I'll see you virtually. But believe me, on the other end of all this chaos, I want to be back with you, and I want a bowl.